Yeah, I think we should start, yes.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our another webinar today at FSR Global, whose topic for today is resource adequacy. I am Amrita, the communications assistant at FSR Global. Just for your information, we are streaming this video live on YouTube, which you can view later as well. Now, I would like to invite Parul Bakshi to take this ahead.
Thank you, Amrita. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone present. Thank you so much for joining us today. Very warm welcome to the EU-India Regulatory Workshop Series. We're in the sixth cycle of this series under the EU CECP, and it is my pleasure to have you all here. And the topic of today's event is resource adequacy, a very timely topic, I feel. And without further ado, I'd like to call upon Bartosz, who's the Councillor, European Union Delegation to India, to please open with his remarks. Over to you, Bartosz.
Hello, good afternoon to everybody. You can hear me, I assume? Yes, good. So thank you very much for inviting me to open this workshop. It's organized in the framework, as Paolo said, the framework of the large and diversified platform of cooperation between India and the EU. It's called the EU-India Clean Energy and Climate Partnership. And yeah, we have been conducting this regulatory workshop series in collaboration with FSR Global for the past 6 years. And this ongoing series of events aims to facilitate discussions on various topics related to clean energy transition, something which is very close to our hearts, both in Europe and I hope also here in India. So today's debate will focus on the topic of resource adequacy. And this, for some people, it may sound quite cryptic, but this expression can be broadly defined in the simplest terms as the ability of a power system to supply enough electricity in the needed time slots and at the right locations, practically to keep the lights on everywhere around the clock during all the year. So this issue is particularly crucial when the power system is undergoing a fundamental change. Such a change we see now, it's the change in the composition of different energy sources, and in this specific case, it's gradually increasing penetration of renewable energy into the grid. And the topic is of particular importance or relevance today, as the Central Electric Authority of India has just recently issued draft guidelines on resource adequacy, precisely to address this challenge of integrating new sources of renewable energy into the grid. And these guidelines aim to ensure a reliable and resilient power system, but at the same time to promote the efficient use of resources and facilitate the transition to cleaner energy resources. In the European Union, we know this issue very, very well, not only because we have started integrating renewables already quite a long time ago, but also because we have this constant challenge of integrating together different national grids, different electricity systems into one European system. So having in mind all those complexities and challenges, we have built in Europe a very special, sophisticated mechanism, which is called European Resource Adequacy Assessment, which is a pan-European monitoring assessment system, which assesses the power system resource adequacy of up to 10 years ahead. It covers all the member states of the European Union, but also other geographically European, but not member states of the EU, which of course they are members, they are parts of our power system, such as Switzerland, Norway, and the countries of the Western Balkans. And the system is based on the state-of-the-art methodologies and probabilistic assessments, aiming to model and analyze possible events which can adversely impact the balance between supply and demand of electric power in the future. It will be an important element for supporting qualified decisions by policymakers on strategic matters, such as the introduction of capacity mechanisms. So, while discussing the Indian proposals, I'm sure it is worth having at least a quick look at what we have done over several years in Europe to ensure the balance and stability of our power system, which is very, very complex and very challenging. So with these words, I don't want to take more your time to leave the discussion in the hands of experts. Those experts will present you with the best practices and innovative solutions in resource planning and management on the way to ensure also a resilient and sustainable energy system for India. So I finish here. I wish you a fruitful discussion and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Bartosz. Thank you for perfectly setting the scene. And I think before I begin the panel discussion, I just want all the participants to know that as the panelists share their insights, please feel free to put in your Q&A in the Q&A box, which you can see on your screen. And let me quickly just introduce all the speakers for the day. So we have with us Mr. Prasad, Chairperson, Central Electricity Authority. As Bartosz mentioned, draft guidelines have been put forth by CEA, so it would be interesting to see Mr. Prasad, his insights and comments on resource adequacy. We have with us Mr. Sooni, former CEO and founder POSOCO, or as we now know it as Grid India. We have with us Christine, who is Assistant Professor, Copenhagen School of Energy Infrastructure. We also have Mr. Yasser, who's Adequacy Modeling Specialist at ENSO-E, and also Shweta Ravi Kumar, who's the Executive Director of FSR Global. So without taking much time, I invite Shweta to please begin by setting the stage and putting forth some questions which we can carry forward as we begin our discussions. Over to you, Shweta.
Thank you, Parul. A very good morning, good afternoon. I think going after Bartosz very effectively summarized what's happening on both sides of the geography. But probably I will try to give a little bit more details on, and I hope that the panelists following me will be able to address some of this. I think resource adequacy as a topic has fascinated both engineers and also those of us who are in the field of energy economics equally. Because this topic has been evolving over the last few decades, more so now because of more intermittent renewables coming into the system. So the question or one of the aspects that I would like the panelists to discuss on is how do we go about resource adequacy planning within this energy transition framework with so many new technologies coming in? Predominantly in the previous years, we had resource adequacy more supply heavy planning, but now with the multi-directional flow of electricity, how do we sort of factor this in when we're looking at resource adequacy planning or assessment? Then, of course, the second question that does come to geographies, both like India and the European Union, is how do we go about resource adequacy planning? Should it be a centralized or a decentralized approach? It maybe need not be a question of either or, but how do you sort of have the best optimal mix of the both of these, factoring into making sure that we have a security of supply situation at a country level or at a regional level, be it in the case of Europe? Then, of course, one of the key requirements to be able to make an effective plan is also availability and data transparency. So what has been the experience in the European side of things with regards to resource adequacy planning, and how India has just started to go about this since last year. So what can we already anticipate and develop in terms of data transparency platforms in order to be able to effectively plan? And then, of course, last, since we also have Yasser from ENSO-E, is more on the kind of modeling tools available. And I think it's exciting from a model development or a tool usage development, because like I did mention before, it's not just supply side heavy. So we're not just looking at capacity expansion models, but how to sort of also factor in the networks. And should the resource adequacy planning or assessment of the future also have the component of the market dynamics coming into this as we transition more and more to more market-based procurement? So with these, I think I would like to give the floor back to Parul to take us through the panelists, and then probably we'll come back to some of these questions during the discussion as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Shweta. So while we might not have all the answers to the questions that Shweta put forth, I think it would be good to kind of see what different perspectives we can bring in today's discussion. And of course, even the participants, please feel free to put in your comments and question answers. So now, Mr. Prasad, I give the floor to you to please open the discussion.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon to everyone. And let me at the outset thank FSR Global to invite me to be a part of this panel, important panel. I think the two speakers have really set the tone very beautifully, what exactly the power sector particularly is facing in terms of the resource adequacy. As far as India is concerned, just to give you a small background, earlier we were not so much focusing on the resource adequacy because we were in a deficit situation. Any resource that was coming and getting integrated into the system was getting absorbed fully, absolutely no issues. Then we realized that since we are in a deficit situation, we need to zero down the deficit, and we focused mainly on the resources that were there, and the quick addition was there. And we ended up into a surplus situation around 4 to 5 years back. This again led to another set of problems, which amounted to some assets, some generation assets getting stressed. And of course, it took us some time to bring them back to, to the thing. But in the meanwhile, what has happened is this has definitely given a negative signal to the investors because of the stress assets. So the situation and what we have learned from our own experience is managing deficit in terms of resources, managing surpluses also in terms of the situations that the country faced. And that is how you must have seen that last four years at least, we have been trying to focus on an adequacy part of it. That means we don't want a deficit situation, but at the same time, we don't want a surplus situation to a larger extent, which leads to a stress condition. And how do we mandate it? Because India itself is almost a replica of European Union. We have a small country in the name of the states, and their demand is almost equal to the states in the Europe, particularly some of the larger states, whether it is UP, Maharashtra, Gujarat, etc. So we are almost equivalent, I'll say, in terms of the modeling, in terms of the parameters, in terms of the exercises that we carry out. The only difference I see is European countries, they attained almost balanced situations a few years back, and we have been a bit lagging in that terms. Anyway, now since we are at almost at par, the focus now in India is that we need to have the mechanism so that everybody, whoever is responsible for ensuring adequacy of resources, are given these responsibilities. And what we could see is it's not only one person who is involved, not only the generators or the government, but it's the entire value chain of the system, which has to be involved in the entire exercise. Normally, as a resource adequacy, we mean that we need to see that the resources, particularly from the supply side, is adequate, and that's it. But then this adequacy has also to be seen, because ultimate objective is not ensuring the supply side adequacy, but attaining that each and every consumer gets the reliable supply and 24/7 quality power. And that's the ultimate aim of the any resource adequacy exercises, that at least we feel it. And that is how you must have seen that first thing that we mandated is legally mandated is through the rules, which was brought in, and then through the guidelines that how it has to be done. And in the guidelines, we have given specific responsibility to the distribution companies, to the load dispatchers, whether it is SLDCs, RLDCs, or NLDCs. So the question that came, I think, was which Sweta rightly pointed out, was whether we should go for a centralized or a state-wise. The philosophy that we have adopted is we will try to ensure both. That means the exercises will be done by the DISCOMs, each DISCOMs as such, because now we have only two references. One is the distribution company or distribution licensee who is supposed to ensure reliable supply to the consumers. And then at the national level, which needs to optimize. I'm sure Europe also must have the similar situations, because we in India have two major factors of this optimization, and that is the diversity and also the differential in particularly from the north and south, east and west. There's a time differential of around 1.5 hours, number one, which leads us to think in that manner. Then, because of the demand pattern differentials between the northern states and the southern part of the country, we need to have that kind of a construct. So using this, what we have thought is it will be done individually. We will ensure individual resource adequacy at the DISCOMs level, optimize it at the national level, and again, give the benefit of this optimization to each and every states depending on their requirement. So that's the approach we have undertaken. And then this calls for a dynamic approach. That means it cannot be, and in fact, earlier also India were planning and doing that planning exercise, but that was almost like a static planning. We used to make a plan every 5 years and forget about what is happening in between that 5-year time period. So what we have now decided, this plans will be a rolling plan. That means every year this plan will have to be revised by the DISCOMs and by the at the national level also. So this is one part. And these responsibility, again, the time duration responsibility has also been fixed. That means 1 year to 5 years detailed planning, and up to 10 years it is going to be a perspective plan which will be rolled out every year based on the progress that has happened in the previous year. But the resource adequacy from the intraday up to 1 year will be the responsibility of the load dispatch centers, whether it is state, within the state, RLDCs, regional load dispatch centers for the region, and the national load dispatch centers for the nation as such. Not only that, since we are also connected with the load dispatch centers of the other countries, some in a synchronous mode, some in the asynchronous mode, we have to take care of that part as well. So now, since I said that the other players are also involved, so we are also now thinking of ensuring adequacy of the transmission network, which is again very, very important, because you might have good resources, adequate resources, but if it is not transmitted properly, then again you will end up into a mess. And this transmission plan again is of the time horizon of 5 years to 10 years. This is again rolling. This rolling we have already started at the national level, and we are dynamically revising it every 6 months. And this is mainly because of the nature of renewable resources. And particularly that has made us to do it in a faster manner. Because solar, wind, they have the gestation period of anywhere between 18 months to 24 months. If I need storage, say battery storage, it can come within 12 months. So we need that kind of a dynamism in the planning of the transmission network, which will facilitate these resources to come in a faster manner. So after covering the transmission adequacy, then we have also given some responsibility to the distribution licensees as well, that you have also to ensure that your network is also adequate enough so that the power is again taken right up to the doorstep of each and every consumers. So entire framework is supposed to be made perfect so that the power flows happens and we achieve the objective of giving reliable supply to the consumer. So I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Prasad. I think you gave really good insights into what India is doing, which then sets the stage to again look at also what is happening at the European Union side of things. And I completely agree with you when you say how India kind of reflects the European Union and the member states, with the Indian states acting as member countries of the EU. Which is why this discussion of today is, I feel, important to see how European Union maneuvered through its journey. But sticking to the Indian perspective for now, I call upon Mr. Suni to, share his viewpoints. Yes, Mr.
Only
Prasad.
one point I think I missed, which Sweta pointed out. Sorry for
No, go ahead, please.
some time from Mr. Soni. That is, she was telling about the changing nature because of the renewables, and that is the bidirectionality of it. And we are cautious of that bidirectionality as well. And that is how the concept of consumers, you might have seen in some of the literatures of India, that we have already introduced the concept of prosumers, vehicle to grid. All that concept is coming back. So that and smart meeting, focus on this smart meeting. That means we would like the entire grid to be interacting in a bi-directional manner. So far, only up to the load dispatch centers, they are talking in a bi-directional manner. From here, we need to really see that the consumer also start talking in that bi-directional manner. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Soni.
Thank you. Over to you, Mr. Suni.
So, thanks, FSR. Thanks, esteemed fellow panelists. And Mr. Prasad has set the stage. So let me start with my experience. I am a rustic operator, and I'm slightly feeling nervous amongst all the scholarly people here. But I have 4 decades of tough experience. We started with load generation balance. We used to work on peak and energy. Reliability every time. Reliability is equal to adequacy plus security. Security for which our heads could roll. So security was taken care of. Adequacy was not there. But we used to make load generation balance report since 1978. I remember the format was known: percentage forced outage, partial outage, dependable year, auxiliary consumption, N-1. Everything was streamlined. But then what happened? Then came market. The moment market came, the question was, how much would you have? How much would you buy? How much would you build? That itself, disturbed our apple cart. And then came the renewables. And we were used to tameable resources. They would listen to our instruction. Now nobody listens to the operator's instructions. And that is the challenge. And that is why we need resource adequacy. Planning exclusively for peak demand is obsolete. For half a century, we have worked on energy requirement, know the load factor, divide it, come to the peak load, and then meet the peak load through load duration curve. This was also ingrained in our bone marrows. And now the generation has suddenly become whimsical. So numbers, we used to have loss of load probability, 0.2%, loss of load expectation, loss of load hours, energy, unserved energy, then expected demand not served, expected energy not served. All these terminologies and theoretical formulations are well known and we are taught. Our national electricity policy way back in 2005 said 5% as reserve. 1 in 10. From where it came, I don't know, but all the power system engineers, they remember 1 in 10. That also came. But now the question is, what is the cost of the new entry? What is the value of lost load? All such things have become important now, more important, I would say. As Mr. Prasad mentioned, our problem is even more complex because of one single grid and diversity in India varies from 5% to 15%. And it can sometimes, in the seasonality, it can go up to 20-25%. And we need to derive strength out of this. We need to leapfrog, we need to borrow from EU, from everywhere else in the world. So few questions I will raise because where will I get such opportunities? Why should we have such high level of reliability numbers? Do we really need it? 1 in 10? Indians are frugal, we are flexible. Give me 50% cheaper, I don't mind 2 in 10. So this is one question which I have a serious concern about it. The other part is the demand response. It has to be part of our equation. Megawatt is extremely important. We cannot afford to keep on building for 1% of 1% of the last, who's utilization factor will be very low. So that's one thing. Being a federal structure, state areas, control areas, distribution, layers within layers, nested loops, then regions within all these complexities are there. And Mr. Prasad also explained, it's very clear to us, it cannot be decentralized or centralized. It has to be decentralized and centralized. We need to have the responsibility from the bottom and then supervision from the top, and somewhere they meet. Of course, it's not very easy to arrive at that, how much in reserve we should share and how much one should be allowed to depend on the market. That remains a question. But one of the very important point, which I have heard from Europeans, but I would like to know further on this and read more on this, is what should be the import capability as a policy for every state? We have one grid. Somebody can say that I will depend on the full market. Would the regulator allow? Or would the regulator say that, no, you cannot depend on the market at all? Show me 100%. Their answer must be lying somewhere in between, but that will decide the number. For example, our average median, if you take 70% import capability, many of the states have. Some average will come out to somewhere around 50%. But some of the states have only 10%, 15% import capability or export capability. They would be in trouble even after they have met all the resource adequacy, is my gut feeling, which comes out. But these numbers have to come out of this. Then the other part is, capacity credit, ELCC, which we talked about. We know wind or solar will be 5%, will be around 20-25%. This has to get into the head of everyone from operator to policymakers, that you need probably 5 times of firm capacity if you are adding renewables. Capacity credit, again, I would say that we should have capacity credit duration curve. One number always frightens me. So like dual duration curve, capacity credit duration curve, all kinds of a duration curve should be available, so the policymakers can take a call, where is the most optimal one. That's another one. Of course, we talked about tools and data. I mean, I fully echo that. That's a serious problem. In theory, everything is fine, but in practice, you get into real trouble. Skill set and human resources, no less important. You can make somebody understand the entire theory, but when it comes to real implementation, many unknowns, and cleaning of data, validating, and then visualizing long-term things are tough. You need battery of experts to do that. And the problem is that it's not 1 or 2, it's an 8, 7, 6, 0 hours, or if not every 15-minute simulation. So the integrity and probity of the entire simulation process is also very important. And how do we visualize that? So I would gather courage to say that I stopped looking at the numbers long back, started looking at the graphs. Now I don't like looking at the graphs. I want to look at the 3D surface of anything which you talk about, so that I know that how smooth is the surface and where are the mischievous and outliers which will put me in trouble. And then I would say that, what is happening to load? Supply side, over concentration, load side, we are coming with e-mobility, e-cooking, electrolyzer. What will be tameable load, moving load of vehicles? They can get synchronized anywhere and get charged anywhere. So what kind of load curve will come? Will the load factor increase or decrease in India? We had a very high load factor because of the shortage. Now it started falling down. But where would it fall, and how the load curve will be tamed? And regulators have intervened, and we have moved all our load to other side. Agriculture load is coming down, but how much it will come down? Maybe it was 30%, it can come down to 20%. So these are the kind of questions which comes in my mind. And then, of course, solar rooftop and the kind of announcement. So that will change the entire thing. And other part is that neither capacity nor energy is enough. We have capacity, we don't have energy. We have energy, but we don't have corresponding capacity. So that's another aspect. And transmission, transfer capability assessment becomes very important even for prospective plan, not to talk of only thing. That's my understanding, but I would like to get more information and stand corrected. And the assumption that the capacity is built and it will be useful is no more valid, and that import dependency, as we discussed about it. And storage requirement, again, one needs a duration curve of storage. How much will give what benefit and other things. Transmission and generation planning correlation has to be understood by the policymakers and regulators, and increasing levels of renewables will certainly challenge the reliability and shift during any time of the day. Now the surprises can come any point of time, and what kind of a contingencies we factor. So with these little fragmented, scattered thoughts, let me abruptly stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Sunny sir. A lot of thought-provoking questions, which I hope we will be getting back to. But one aspect that you mentioned was on demand response. And I think we have a speaker here, Christine, who will be following up. And let's go a bit to the European Union side. And Christine, so I invite you to please come in and share your insights.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for organizing this webinar and for having me. And thanks to the previous speakers for already raising some interesting points that, as you say, I can probably pick up on. I did prepare 2 slides to get my points across, so I will try to quickly share them into the webinar. If not, I can also just do as my previous speakers did. Yeah, so now you can see them in non-screen mode. And now I imagine you can see them in full screen mode. Can you confirm that? Yeah, seems like it. Okay, so let me just quickly directly switch to the first one. I mean, we've already, since we dialed into this webinar, we probably have an idea of what resource adequacy is or should be. And we've heard some thoughts on what are the relevant elements. So this is really just an overview. However, at the center here, I want to bring across this vision. When we talk about resource adequacy, we often think about balancing demand and supply and so on, but I want to add this perspective that it's really also about balancing uncertain and intermittent elements and reliable and dispatchable elements. Of course, if we had no uncertain or intermittent elements, then all of them would be dispatchable, and therefore we wouldn't really have so much concerns about resource adequacy rather than just whether demand matches supply. But it really becomes more of an issue the more uncertain and intermittent things are. And unfortunately, in that respect, that is what a low carbon energy system generally entails: more uncertain, more intermittent elements. And that's why we're more concerned now with resource adequacy than we used to be. And then usually we have these at least 2 different perspectives in there where we look at the short term. So given the capacities and the things that we've already built, or that we will have built at a certain point in time in the future, will those be sufficient and adequately managed to really match at any point in time? But then also taking the longer term perspective where we really want to adjust the capacity mix and the elements in the system in order to balance between some uncertain and some reliable elements. Now, for uncertain elements and intermittent elements, we can have things to balance like forecast errors, equipment failure, and maybe some supply chain disruptions, as we have experienced quite painfully in Europe in the past couple of years. And then in the long term, we could be looking at some plants being retired and too many or not enough other plants being invested and started up at the same time. We also have quite some concerns about how demand levels are evolving, at what level in general, but also what kind of profiles we're going to see from new types of demands in the future. And then we have some, from a resource adequacy, quite unsettling developments regarding prosumers. Essentially, suddenly users of the system start doing what they want and not what we are used to them doing. And also some kind of decentral backup considerations, which essentially make it more uncertain what kind of energy demands are being met from the overall system or decentrally. Those would be the uncertain elements that we want to balance out. And then we have thankfully also a toolbox of dispatchable elements available to sort of match those. And in the short term, of course, we can talk about dispatchable generators. You've mentioned beforehand how previously people used to listen to the system operator when they were told to dispatch. That's obviously a very nice scenario for resource adequacy, and it's not that much the case anymore. The more we have markets and the more we have flexible and interruptible players. But sort of in exchange for that, we have this new group of dispatchable elements in the system, and this would be flexible and interruptible loads. So especially historically, we didn't really think about loads as something that we would also dispatch, steer, and control. The load was the given factor that was supposed to be met. And this notion is crumbling the more we move to a low carbon energy system, just because of the sheer necessity of it. I think even in previous energy systems, loads have been to some extent flexible and it could have been interrupted. And there's sort of a discrete function of values of lost load, so that some loads could actually have been shed or moved at a relatively low cost. We just didn't make use of that because we didn't need to. But now that the framework is changing, this is becoming more and more of a concern that we should, if there is some possibility to shift loads, we should make use of that. In the short term, obviously, now we also increasingly have storage capacity available to increase adequacy. And then in the long term, of course, we want to make sure that there's some reserve and peak capacity available. It can be generation mostly. There's a lot to be done about interconnection capacity, sort of sharing reserve and peak capacities across regions. So we don't need to have them available just for this one region that we're talking about. And increasingly in the long term, I think that we will also be thinking about restricted connection agreements. So both generators, intermittent generators, and flexible loads will already in their agreements where they attach themselves to the system accept some kind of rules that their supply can be interrupted, can be controlled to a certain extent. And it's, I think, it's those two elements that are highlighted in red that I want to focus on with my next point, and that's also already my last point, at least for these initial thoughts. Looking at demand flexibility a bit more, because all these other elements, I feel there are more and more standard. It's really just a question of how do we calculate them, how do we know how to make the right modeling in order to plan them out for the future. But with the demand flexibility, I would say we have a bit of a more tricky challenge here. Because we have on the one hand the technologies, I've put them up here. We have some industrial processes that are flexible. We could have commercial heating and cooling that can to some extent react to adequacy challenges. We have heat pumps both on the individual level and pooled, for example, in a district heating system. And we also have prominently electric vehicles, both individual and in fleets, that can to some extent be controlled or it can react to the adequacy needs of the system. But the problem really is, and that is also what I think, Mr. Suni, you have nicely put from the system operator perspective, that it's very hard to get a good idea and some trust as to how reliable a resource this will be in the future, because it's thinkable that we will all use our electric vehicles differently because of an adequacy need. But if we plan for 5 years ahead, 10 years ahead, we really want to be sure, because if it doesn't happen in the end, then we would have rather built another power plant, and that would have been there for us to rely on. So there is a lot of additional factors than just having the technology ready in the system here, because this is distributed and because it interacts with a lot of other frameworks. And I've put this here as the regulatory, societal, and political framework, where on the one hand, we would be looking at some kind of contracts for curtailment and limited capacity in order to really lock in that this flexibility that we can see on the demand side would really be available, because this is contractually fixed. I mean, this in general, or in theory, this also applies to decentralized generation, where you could curtail wind or solar generation, but I'm just focusing on the demand side here. So also for the demand, especially for industrial and commercial demands, it seems very feasible to just assess with the businesses what kind of reliability do they really need, and then only contract the type and the level of reliability that is actually needed, and then also only build the adequacy from the other elements that is actually required to match the specific requirements of this demand. And in order to then embed this properly, there's also a need to have some kind of ambitious flexibility in policy and planning scenarios, because if the planning scenarios just focus on adequacy in the traditional way, in the reliable technical way, then the flexibility will always only be an add-on. If we don't start trusting it on it and planning for it, that means it's not considered, and we will always have some kind of interconnection capacity or a plant capacity to back it up anyways, and therefore the need or the pressure to really deliver on the flexibility side is not there. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem, where from the policy side, I think there's a statement to be made, some commitment that they're actually counting on the flexibility, and this will then also be a signal to those who develop aggregation scheme and business models around this, that this is going to be supported from the political side. Obviously, there's a large case to be made about market rules that should be suitable for distributed actors and for active demands. There's a lot of hurdles. I'm speaking mostly for Europe. There's a lot of hurdles for the demand side to participate adequately in the system, and therefore a lot of the capacity or the potential for flexibility isn't used yet. Planners look at this and they say, well, it's not even used. We don't even use the flexibility capacity that we have right now. So how should we trust that we're going to use more of it in the future? Again, the market rules need to be there first in order for the trust to come later. And then this also speaks to, again, what you said, Mr. Sunny, about, you said, I remember you said Indians are frugal and flexible, right? So I like that statement, because I feel that especially in the context of looking beyond Europe, we have this opportunity that because customers or electricity users aren't yet so spoiled and used to a full-time, no worries supply from the plug as in the Western world we have established in the past, we now have this chance that you don't even get them used to that in the first place, but establish with knowledge building and sort of empowering different actors to really establish an electricity supply mentality, if you will. That doesn't mean that you have less of a standard of living or less of a business environment for your commercial activities, but you really just incorporate an adequacy thinking into new energy and electricity uses that come on board in the future. And then you can actually get ahead of Europe in that sense, because we now need to retrain some of our electricity customers to accept and get used to intermittent contracts and curtailment in the future, whereas you can maybe just skip that step and establish that that is what is the best for the system in the first place. And with that, I will close my thoughts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christine. I think we're already getting some questions on the demand side uncertainties that you highlighted here. But before we get into that, and Yasser, if you allow me, Mr. Prasad has to leave. So I would actually quickly like to take maybe a few questions which have been directed to him, and then I'll ask you to take the stage. So sorry for that. But Mr. Prasad, I know you have another meeting and you'd be jumping out of this call in another 15 minutes. So I thought I'll take the opportunity to address some of the questions which have been put forth. So there's one where Mr. Mishra is asking about how demand. So Draft Resource Guidelines suggest 70% procurement should be in long term, 10 to 20% in medium, and remaining is to be met via short term procurement, which is approximately the same that discoms are already doing. So he asks, however, the long term PPAs are not yet happening on ground other than RE through SECI. Would this affect ensuring procurement profile going forward? Any quick response?
I think he has not understood the entire resource adequacy framework properly. There are two elements of tying up of the power in what we have mentioned in the guidelines. One is the resource adequacy for their own purpose, and one is the resource adequacy at the time when the national peak is occurring. So there are two different times it will be happening in each of the, for each of the discoms. So when the national peak is happening, at that time, he has to tie 100% of the power. 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 100 no, I mean, nobody can say that I have not tied up this power to meet the national corresponding to the national peak demand. So whatever is their contribution, they will have to tie up the entire 100% of that power. The leverage has already been given in case of meeting their own demand, which might be occurring at a different point of time. Okay. So by this, what we are trying to do? We are trying to see that the whenever national peak demand is occurring, that means that's the highest resource that my country needs. And if everybody has 100% tied up that capacity, that means I'll ensure that the demand is met. At any other time, the demand will be lesser than the peak demand, and the capacity is already there with me. So that can be used. And the surplus capacity will be with somebody, and deficit capacity with some other person. So this can be traded or exchanged. And what Mr. Soni was telling, market development will happen like this one. No
Thank you.
leverage.
Yeah, there's another follow-up question so whether resource adequacy study has to be annual exercise for DISCOM SLDC, whether they needs to set up permanent IT infrastructure, and if any support would be made available to them under the PSDF.
For IT infrastructure, we have been harping all the DISCOMs for quite some time. It's not now. Every DISCOM must have a IT vertical, because now everything is all IT driven, and we can't think of having an organization which is not having an IT vertical. That's number one. Second question. What was the initial part? Sorry, I missed it.
So whether the resource adequacy study has to be annual exercise for DISCOM and SLDC.
Yeah, come. Yes, it has to be an annual exercise. They can't now wish away by saying that I have done a planning for 5 years or 10 years and not revising it every time. So DISCOM definitely will have to carry out every year, and which in any case they will have to demonstrate before the state commission. And state commission will do a due diligence on that as well. But for day-to-day activities, the load dispatch centers will have to do that exercise every day. For intraday, day ahead, week ahead, month ahead, quarter, and up to an year. So it will be the responsibility of the load dispatch center to ensure that the adequate resources have been tied up.
Thank you. I think one aspect was he asked if there's any support which would be made available under PSDF. I assume it was linked to the IT infrastructure point.
IT infrastructure, I think if what you require is the manpower and the setup, what else you require? And I don't see that any DISCOM or any DISCOM has asked for a support on that account. It's an organizational thing which any DISCOMs must do it.
Right. So I think maybe one last question before you have another 10 minutes. So how this resource adequacy exercise is different from load generation balance report study happening each year, and also the study happening under long-term medium generation and load forecast study. So basically he's asking the difference.
Difference is the dynamism, number one. Number two, what I mentioned is now you have to see each and every factor in it. I think Mr. Soni was trying to get into those terminologies, whether it was LOLP or energy not served or capacity credit and everything, all those jargons, which I'll not re-mention now, but they are supposed to be factored in and they have to be rightly understood. It's not only saying that I have run a model, got a number, and that number is blindly accepted. No. You have to see it in perspective. You have to see with respect to your own requirement and try to make your judgment. That is more important. And that is how now we are saying is it has to be a dynamic exercise wherein everybody or everyone who is involved in the entire value chain has to be involved throughout, and every day it has to be done.
Thank you, Mr. Prasad. There's another question, if you allow me. In our draft resource adequacy framework, have you given any weightage to economic and financial considerations to reliability criteria?
Economic considerations are taken care when we are doing the demand. the econometric method. And in the econometric method, we do take care of the all the financial parameters.
Okay. Would you have time for more questions or?
Quick, maybe another 1 or 2 minutes.
Okay, great. Thank you. So, of course, like at a later stage, we can also have other panelists react to these questions. I'm sorry, because Mr. Prasad has to leave, we thought it would be good to have his insights in here. So, I apologize to the other panelists and thank you for your patience. So, we have a question which says, how can we better train the system to flatten the load curve so that we do not overbuild the system to meet the peak demand and optimally meet the off peak?
I think what Mr. Soni was mentioning is I don't now care for the graph. And same goes here as well. Now it's all analogous, nothing digital. So each and every instant of time, I must see that it happens, right? So that's the kind of granularity that we are now going to achieve.
Right. So I think in regard to the granularity, there's also a question focusing on the decentralized solutions that we're looking at. So the question is, can decentralized solutions contribute significantly towards making us resource adequate? If yes, how? I mean,
Absolutely, that will happen, and that we are also focusing on it. You must have seen recently that we have made DRE, that means rooftop solar and other, a specific obligation under the renewable purchase obligation, and this will be coming from the distributed, including solar rooftops. This will help. This will definitely help, and this will definitely give me a leverage in terms of lesser requirement from the transmission and distribution network side.
so I think, Mr. Prasad, probably the last question linked to this decentralized uncertainties that we're talking about. There's a question which asks that what are your recommendations on dealing with uncertainties in demand pattern changes due to uncertainties in growth in DRE, prosumers, EV, and the technological changes that we've been talking about in the panel discussion so far. So how do we deal with these demand pattern uncertainties?
Uncertainties are broadly will be taken care, because now, as I mentioned to you, and again I am mentioning it, that we don't want to wait for things to happen, but we would like to be updated or updated almost every day, and at least on a longer time horizon, at least every year. So that's the kind of thing that we'll be trying to, and this will take care of all my uncertainties. Uncertainty, by that I mean is, so for example, I had thought that so much AVE is likely to come and it has not come, or the other way around. It has come, but it has come in a larger number. So both situations have to be dealt in a larger manner. Say, for example, even uh, recently or recent few months, if you see, the demand growth has gone even 20%, more than 20%. We have immediately factored in that and revised our NEP. You will very soon see a notification coming out from Government of India, revised construct of the entire next 10 years plan. So we are now dynamic. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for taking the time out and joining us today. And as I mentioned, we will be getting back to some of these points which Mr. Prasad raised and the questions that have been put forth. Please keep the questions coming. And now I go back to Yasser. Thank you for being so patient. And Yasser, the floor is all yours. I think a lot has been said, and it would be interesting to see it from a modeling perspective on how do we bring in all these multiple aspects of resource adequacy into a model, utilizing the data and kind of helping us with resource adequacy planning. Over to you, Yasser. I think, yeah.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now. Maybe you can make it in presentation mode. You can see your screen.
Can you see my screen?
Yeah, we can. It's not in presentation mode. Would you like to? Yeah.
Is it okay now?
I think for me, it's yeah, perfect. Please go ahead.
Okay. Hello from my side to all the speakers and also to all the participants. I am Yasser Tohidi. I work for NSOE. NSOE is a European Association for Cooperation of Transmission System Operators in Europe. NSOE has several mandates, but the main point is to collect data, making the cooperation between the TSOs, and in order to make sure that the European targets are met accordingly. In this presentation, I will focus mainly on ERA, which is one of the products at NSOE, which is also an adequacy product. And to put it into the context, I created this slide that says where the ERA fits in the high-level European targets and regulations. So we have clean energy package, which sets the rules for European energy sector in order to be compliant with Paris Agreement. So it has its own targets of, for example, on efficiency, on buildings, energy consumption, on renewable integration, etc. For renewable integration, it's has a target to reach 32% by 2030, and also we have the net zero energy, net zero carbon neutrality for 2050. So it has several targets, and also it says the rules for different associations in order to make sure these targets are met. And two important regulations which are mentioned and are relevant to our discussions are KONE Vol RS, which stands for Cost of New Entry, Value of Lost Load, and Reliability Standard methodology, which should be done by each member state, and also the ERA, European Resource Adequacy Assessment, which is a product mandated to NSOE. And these two products go hand in hand. How? Well, the ERA is not exclusively used in this way that I mentioned in this slide, but this is one of the main usage of ERA, which is that using the result of ERA as a European Resource Adequacy Assessment for member states who want to apply for capacity mechanisms. So if ERA shows that there is adequacy concern in certain member states, first they have to make sure that they address the regulatory distortions, and second, they can apply for capacity mechanism, but in the condition that they have already done the first, the KONE, VOL, and RS. So they have defined the reliability standard in this methodology according to the requirements and definitions of this methodology. And of course, this adequacy concern, as I said, should have been identified in ERA. I will explain how and where these two products are connected, and also I come back to some references to this clean energy package later on. In a European level, how different adequacy how the adequacy is seen, how the system is planned, basically, you can see in this slide. So we have a 10-year network development plan, which is a product for each 2 years, and it looks at longer than 10 years. So here we look at the policy decisions. Here we look at more uncertain futures, so more scenarios for the future. and it basically resolves to the best optimal transmission plan for the scenarios that are considered. And then we have ERA, which looks at 1 to 10 years ahead. And here, considering the uncertainties, of course, when you come closer to real time, the uncertainties decrease. So here we don't have the scenarios, for example, that was under investigation in UNDP, but here we have also uncertainty scenarios regarding the temperature, so the climatic scenarios, etc. And here in this step, basically the generation investment decisions are looked at and are analyzed in order to see how that will affect the adequacy level of member states and Europe in general. Then we have seasonal outlook. So this becomes closer to the real time. So some of the uncertainties decrease, but also when you go closer to real time, the model that we create is becoming more accurate, let's say, in terms of because some of the uncertainties are already realized. For example, some of the maintenances planned better. So also some of the hydro targets are modeled with more detail in this study, and then we have basically weekly close to real time, again adequacy analysis done by RSCs, which are several in Europe, and they are coordinating the regional security issues and in closer regions in cooperation with TSOs in closer regions in Europe. Now I will more focus on ERA itself. So what is ERA? First, we have data. Of course, it's very important. It has to be coming from the member states, from TSOs, and it has to be compliant with the national energy and climate plans, which are also another requirement set by clean energy package. So in terms of the data that we collect for performing ERA, we have an European market modeling database. So this is all the detailed data about generation capacities, unit by unit, and the data about different technical parameters that these units have. We have to model the network as accurate as possible. There are two ways, NTCs, that has been used until last year, let's say, in ERA, but we are moving completely to flow-based. This year, flow-based is the approach that is used also in the market in Europe to model a transmission system in a transparent way, and also respecting the bidding zone definitions in the internal electricity market of Europe. And then we have climatic data coming from Pan-European climate database, which basically creates our scenarios for our climate scenarios on capacity factors of wind and solar and hydro inflows, and also on temperature profiles. And then separate from this, we have, well, not completely separate, because temperature and also some of the data from PMMDB is used in our demand forecasting tool, which also creates scenarios for the demand. All of this data is given to EVA step. So this is a step that investment decisions are revised. So basically, we do an economic viability assessment on generation capacities in order to see which of them are viable to stay in the market or not, or which new resources might come to the market. So here our input or our economic parameters, as I mentioned in the previous slide, well, in the first slide about the Kone, Vol, and RS. So here is the connection between the two studies, the two methodologies. So here for economic parameters, we use the data from Kone, Vol, and RS study in terms of WACC, CapEx, fixed cost, and also the new entries that we consider in each member state as a candidate for expansion. In addition to that, from PMMDB, from TSOs, we collect other parameters about the units, like if they are policy technologies, so they are used as other for other requirements, so they are protected from decommissioning, let's say, and also some other parameters. So all of these inputs are created and given to the model. And then we run a 10-year horizon expansion, long-term model. At this step, it's a one-shot model, so the uncertainty on climatic scenarios should be modeled as a stochastic modeling approach. So it means this is a huge model, so we cannot look at every climatic scenario. So we have to have a pre-process step of selecting representative climatic years by clustering them and giving some weights to them. And after running this model, we have the result, which, as I said, is it revises basically the data that we collect from TSOs, and we find some units not viable. So, or we think that in 10 years ahead, for example, certain capacities are is very attractive to be invested and come to the market. So after doing this step, the economic viability assessment, then we enter to the final step of calculation of adequacy levels in each member state, and this is our economic dispatch model. So here we have we are not restricted, let's say, by the bulkiness of the model. So here we can, because you can run everything separately. It's not like previous step that has to be one single big long-term model. So here we can have a lot of, we can have much more climatic scenarios. We can have scenarios representing the random outages of generation units and transmission plants, so we can create many scenarios, and we do the economic dispatch for each target year of our model for this for each of these scenarios. And the result of this is finally our adequacy metrics, which is basically the loss of load expectation and expected energy not served. So This final adequacy metric, if I want to put it into context of the first slide, we had the reliability standard. So here, the LOLE calculation for each member state. If it's so here, it's interesting to look at if it's higher than the reliability standard, then it has to be complemented, as I said, by looking at the regulatory distortions, and also it can be complemented by national studies in order to see where what is the concern here, and if everything is cleared in this further assessments, then that country that member state can apply for capacity mechanisms, as I said. So yeah, that's it. That's ERA.
Thank you. Thank you, Yasser. I think it was very interesting to know the nitty-gritties of the ERA process. And I think at this point of time, I would really like Mr. Suni, if you could come in and probably what are your thoughts on kind of what Yasser suggested? To what extent is India implementing something on those lines? Do we need to change certain things? Are we in the right direction? Just your reaction to this, Suni sir.
When we need all these things. It's, I mean, it doesn't cost much, as Mr. Prashad also mentioned. After all, we have tools, we have people, and coming out with these numbers is always a good practice. Now, in practice, in whether the policymakers will be influenced by which one is a secondary question. So I would say that we should have everything: VOLL, CONE, LOLH, LOLP, DNSS, EN, everything should be there. Then we will see what to take, what to not take, where tinkering is required, what parameter is costing how much, and then the decisions can be taken. But as far as the intrinsic capacity building is concerned, we must be ahead of the curve. Thank you.
Thank you, Suni sir. Completely agree. I think I would also go back to some of the questions as promised, because at that point of time, we could only ask Mr. Prasad to react. But okay, firstly, I think Yasser, there's a question by somebody asking, is the ERA model a capacity expansion model?
The ERA as a whole, no, but the EVA part, yes, that's exactly the capacity expansion model. So the middle step where we model a 10-year long-term planning mathematical model. Yeah, that's a capacity expansion, and the result is, as I said, viability of the units, yes or no, and also viability of existing units, and also what about expanding new units in the system if needed.
Thanks. Can I just add, I wanted to ask you about this transition from planning happening at the member state level to the EU level. Can you maybe shed some light on how European Union has kind of gone through that process? Because as Sunisa mentioned earlier, for like Indian states are almost equivalent to EU member states, and we're looking at our planning process. So even from a modeling perspective, when you talk about all of these different data points, any challenges, anything that you can highlight on this transition that you went through in expanding the modeling for resource adequacy planning?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I'm not sure if I'm the best person to answer it, but I will try. So as I said, there is these targets defined in the European level, and also these targets should be translated in according. So these targets should be translated in national level by national NECP, National Energy and Climate Plan. So there are rules for member states to be compliant with this. So the data that we receive, we assume that it's compliant with those targets and with the related planning of member states according to that target. So this is the data we receive, but of course we do a public consultation on the data in order to make everybody have a look and bring in their concerns if it's not in line with the planning of member states, or if that planning is not in line with the targets. So we do some back and forth discussion with TSOs in order to correct this if there is a major issue. And then we do our ERA on top of that.
Thank you so much. Christine, some of the previous questions which I asked Mr. Prasad, I think it would be interesting to kind of see your reaction to those as well. One of the questions was that what are your recommendations on dealing with uncertainties in demand pattern changes due to uncertainties in growth in DRE? And another one asked on how can we better train the system to flatten the load curve so that we do not overbuild the system to meet the peak demand and optimally meet the off-peak. So Christine, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I will try. So maybe to start with the last one regarding flattening the load curve. I mean, when we talk about the actual system peak, that is a thing, we want to flatten it, but I want to be a bit cautious about flattening load as a general objective, because while we're dealing with a system where we have intermittent generation, there could be some times where we also have a generation peak. And so long as we can transmit this energy, there's no need to flatten. And that's also why when we talk about incentives to make consumers have a more flat consumption, either individually or as a consumer group, we have to be careful to not overdo it and give them incentives to be very flat, in a sense that never exceed a certain capacity and never and potentially even have the same constant consumption all the time. From a system operation perspective, that's not necessarily desirable. There could be situations where we actually can deal with a peak, and then any framework that we set up to incentivize demand could also or should also potentially allow for consumers to actually match a peak in generation, as I said, so long as it can be transmitted and distributed in the system. And that's why, I mean, also my research focuses a lot on tariff structure, has focused a lot on tariff structures. And then you have a lot of tools available to, for example, have a tariff for a consumer, it could be individual consumer, private consumer, or an industrial consumer, to say your contract stipulates you cannot exceed a certain demand overall. It's like your fuse capacity or some kind of capacity limit. And then that means from that perspective, you can be sure that this consumer will not exceed this demand, because maybe technically it's not even possible, or there would be a high penalty to exceeding it. But then if you want to integrate this same consumer in some kind of balancing scheme or in a redispatch situation, then you would have to make sure that in the end, they can actually exceed it if it is desirable from the system perspective. And then if you already incorporate that thought that you might need them to match a generation peak at some point, you might not want to give them such a strict contract in the first place, but have a more dynamic signal that they react to. On the other hand, if you have very dynamic signals, then you will have, especially at the private level, some consumers who can't actually handle this. And then the question is, are they linked to some kind of aggregator, a digital solution that does that for them? Then maybe they can handle the complicated signal after all. Or if it's a commercial industrial consumer, you can assume that they have some procurement department who's going to incorporate and implement something feasible to actually work with a very complicated from the perspective that otherwise you would just be doing what you want with your electricity. Then you could have a setup where they can actually handle this kind of complexity. And therefore, just the easy target of flattening the curve, and also for everyone with one instrument, that's probably not what we're getting. We really have to embrace the diversity of those demand response options that we have, and then have targeted solutions for all of them. But and then leading to the first question, which I think was on how reliable, how can we, like, how much demand response can we actually rely on? I think a good way to start is to rely on what we think we can contract, even in the mid or long term or something like that. Because if you are if you have some kind of decentralized distributed tariff response where because the market price is high, now you expect consumers to consume less. That's something that will probably happen. And over time, you will build some experience and some confidence as to how much of that you can expect in a certain system, maybe also given on the technology mix that you have in that system. But regardless of that, when you talk about adequacy and we don't yet have that experience, it's a lot about what kind of contracts do we have. If we have a contract where a certain, say, industrial consumer commits that within their production schedules, they are able to shed load for a day or something like that, or sort of reschedule their production processes if they know a week in advance that it will be necessary or something like that. And the contract clarifies that. And that, I would assume, is a resource, a demand resource that we can actually rely on. And then you can also incorporate a penalty for violating that contract, which would cover whatever is your alternative option to still keep the system running if that doesn't happen. And this then I would consider, but others might disagree, a relatively reliable resource from the contract side. And then other resources that are more decentralized, more implicit, they can come on top based on the experience that we gain with them. And this is why also it's important that you're saying these assessments are redone every year or so, because we gain in this experience and we see how some policy framework, some capacity building is working, and how we have more resources that we can for the future assessments then also rely on.
Thank you, Christine. So we have one more question, asking about the VOLL, the survey that I think, Yasser, you mentioned. So it's saying VOLL is estimated through consumer surveys, is the question. And he's asking if you can elaborate on the process and what is the periodicity of such surveys. Yasser, would you like to take this?
I'm not sure about this. So surveys for sure are part of the process, but not exclusively. But the detail of this, how this is mentioned in the methodology, I'm not sure. But as I said, this is hand in hand with cost of new entry and reliability standard, because these three parameters are complementing each other, and if you change one, the others also change. But how exactly in the methodology this is done, or how in each member state the estimation of value of lost load and these other parameters are done, I'm not the best person to answer this.
Thank you. Thanks, Yasser. So I think we have actually a lot more questions, but we're running a bit short on time. So I apologize, but what I'll do is try to use these questions and ask the panelists to move towards their concluding remarks as well. So Suni sir, there's a question, and if you could club that with your some concluding remarks as well, which is what, according to Mr. Suni, would be the possible solutions in order of priority?
It's really a challenging one. But there is no silver bullet, first thing. We got to do everything starting from data to tools to skill set, have clarity of what kind of reliability criteria you want to adapt, have the capability to simulate, have the rigor of doing things more diligently and then analyze. It doesn't cost much. The amount of money we spent towards capacity expansion, it's the second decimal place which you will spend. Somehow that culture has to come, and we are talking about IT verticals and then funding. What is so great funding? One wrong generator commission, your lifetime capacity building of this can be funded. So I'm very sure that our policymakers, besides making good regulations and policies, should also have a companion orders earmarking the resources for each utility. That first you show me where is your tool, where is your hardware, where are your people, where is your skill set. I think then it will get translated. So that's how I would look at it. Rest all other things, great people like Yasser and Kristen, they will give us all kinds of solutions, not a problem at all. Academia is full of solutions, but how do we do that? I have another question to my both co-panelists. Please help me if you can do that. How much should be the transfer capability or transmission export capability of every state? At least some benchmarking, some mandating, because the advantage of entire interconnected system, you all know the problem. So is there any reference to that?
Thank you,
Anyone
Suni.
can take up?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Suni sir. Thank you so much. Christine, maybe you could react to Suni sir's question and also club it with your concluding remarks.
Yeah, okay, so I'll go for the question first. I'm not aware that there is a straight answer to that, but as an academic, I feel very comfortable saying it depends. And I think it would depend on the one hand, what kind of system you have, because I mean, for interconnection capacity, we have this general thing that if you have very different types of intermittent resources in different parts of the subcontinent, then you would want to interconnect them just to level out the intermittency to some extent. And then that is one aspect that gives validity to the thought of interchanging so much. In Europe, we're thriving to have ever more interconnection, but I'm not aware that that is necessarily to the same level taken into account when it comes to the adequacy. So it's being used and stipulated a lot in order to make electricity supply cheaper in general. But then when it comes to adequacy, there's still a lot of concerns at the national level where you don't want to, even though we're all very friendly and reliable towards each other, we don't want to rely entirely on our neighbors for that. And then it becomes more of a political question, how you have a build-up time of another, I don't know, maybe 10, 15 years for a new power plant. If you find out at some extent that you couldn't rely on your neighbor as much as you thought you could, then that is sort of the time span you have in order to get it right if you didn't react in other terms. So it's, yeah, I think it's a matter of what your system looks like and what kind of trust you want to stipulate amongst the regions that are interconnected. And then for some kind of closing statement, well, I came in here into this webinar waving the flag of demand response, so I'm not going to stop now. I don't necessarily think it is the most important or the largest tool in the box towards resource adequacy, but I think it's the one that deserves and requires the most attention at this point, because it has been a bit, or yeah, so far it's being a bit overlooked. So I think there's a lot of welfare to be lost if we don't address demand response adequately in this adequacy puzzle. And it is a bit tricky to assess. You won't manage to address it in the same ways that you did with other capacities, such as building new plants, building storage facilities, and so on. So you really should get into or we all collectively need to get into the transactional systems, the political framework, and maybe even societal framework to reap this, rather than build new expensive capacity that we wouldn't need if we also tapped into demand response sufficiently. Yeah, and that's it from my side.
Thank you, Christine. I think a lot of discourse going on related to demand response in India as well. So I agree with what you said. And Yasser, if you'd like to react to what Suni sir asked and also give your concluding remarks.
Thanks. How to optimally use the transmission connection is an interesting topic. I mentioned flow-based. So in Europe, we have bidding zones. So each bidding zone is basically each country is a bidding zone, except some member states who have more. But then the question is, how do you model the transmission for your adequacy study and considering this bidding zone, how you do it? So we have at core and also in Nordics, we have flow-based. And just to directly, so okay, you can have a look on these methodologies and see in full detail how the capacity for trade is considered in this flow base, but we have a rule of we call it 70% rule. So 70% of cross-border lines, cross-border capacities should be available to the market. But in this flow-based methodology, there are more detailed requirements in order to adjust the level that is given to the market if certain rules are applied are not considered are not properly applied. But anyways, this is an interesting thing, and you can have on our flow-based methodology, which is the currently the approach used in European internal electricity market. But on top of that, I wanted to emphasize more on the data handling and modeling of more and more flexible resources that we have in consumption side. So we have increased our categories of our demand response units in ERA, and we have improved it. We are going to improve it even further because there are more types of flexible resources coming into the market, and also in addition to that, again about the network. So this is an important part of the modeling. So there is a review of bidding zones in progress. So and also the flow base, and also the curtailment sharing, which comes after the flow base, because flow base is might result to flow factor competitions, and then you need to share the curtailed load. To revise that, again, you can see the further details about this in the flow-based methodology, etc. And also the global warming effect. So in our scenarios, we are considering more and more either expanding our climatic scenarios to include more extreme scenarios, or to use some state-of-the-art models that can bring in the effect of global warming into our uncertainty and climate scenarios.
Thank you so much, Yasser. Suni sir, you also have a response from one of our participants on the question that you raised, so maybe we can share that response with you. I'll go back to Shweta. So Shweta, you started with asking with like a lot of questions, so maybe some concluding remarks from your end as well.
Thanks, Parul. I think my concluding remark is that this topic requires a discussion every other week, because as Suni sir said, it encompasses a mini universe where we need to look at the different interlinkages. It's not a 1 and 0 problem that we're trying to solve. But maybe a quick reaction to a question that we had in the chat, which is about, do we have the modeling tool, and how can we sort of build capacity in India? And I think from what Yasser presented, it's clear that there is no perfect tool available ready-made that you can use. Every country would need to customize whatever tools are there to fit in their needs, including that's what NSOE is doing at their end. So even in the case of India, there is no ready off-the-shelf tool that would give us everything. The one or two that is available are also sometimes prohibitively expensive. So if we need to be able to use it at large scale, we will probably need to develop something a little bit more open access. That means those of us working on the topic within India, we need to collaborate closely, because perfecting a tool such as this for India is a minimum 5-year affair. So if anybody tells us that the tool can throw an answer right back at us in 6 months down the lane, it'll give you the answer, but not the right kind of answer. So I think to have a India-specific tool, it would require all of us to collectively put our muscles and brains into it. So I think it's an ongoing process. And as a consequence of developing such tool would be also us streamlining the data which Mr. Suni also rightly flagged. And also, I think Mr. Ghanshyam did bring in the relevance and importance of that. I think standardization of data platforms where we can use the right kind of data without it being corrupted but through passing of hands to be able to model will give us a much more accurate results. And I think we will need a lot more experts, engineers and economists to be able to use such a tool, both at central and state level, to start answering some of the questions flagged here. So I think this is an ongoing deliberation that we will have to do, and we will be continuing on this topic over the next months as we embark on expanding our own capacity and understanding this topic. So do stay tuned for this. This is just sort of an opening primer on the topic. And you will hear back from some of us or almost all of us on this topic over the coming months. So thank you so much. And with that, I would like to close today's session. I think we've gone a little bit over time, but thank you for staying in and listening to us. We'll come back to you next time with another topic. Hopefully it's on offshore wind. So do stay tuned, and we will keep everyone posted. Have a wonderful afternoon and a lovely day for those of you in Europe.